in Canada. Things are happening that are worth covering, which is a rarity. We don't cover Canadian politics all that extensively here on the Ben Shapiro Show because, hey, I mean, it's Canada. However, the trucker protests that have now spawned like-minded protests all over the world are a major, major news story, and they should be a major news story. You have literally thousands of truckers who are descending on Ottawa, which is the capital, and they are also now blocking the Ambassador Bridge in Toronto, which is the single biggest bridge connecting the United States and Canada in terms of trade, according to the Washington Post. The busiest crossing on the U.S.-Canada land border was blockaded Tuesday as demonstrations against vaccine mandates that have paralyzed Canada's capital spread through a crucial trade artery while inspiring similar protests from Europe to Australia. The Ambassador Bridge, which links Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, was temporarily closed for passengers and commercial traffic, authorities on both sides of the border said on Tuesday. The Windsor police said limited traffic was being allowed into the United States. The 1.6-mile suspension bridge is an important trade link, particularly for the region's auto industry. It also connects families, friends, and essential workers, including Canadian nurses who work in Detroit area hospitals. The blockade there apparently began on Monday. It was unclear when it might end. Local law enforcement said there were between 150 and 200 vehicles and roughly 200 people involved. The U.S. Transportation Department estimates the bridge carries about 30% of all annual trade between Canada and the United States. This is all part of the so-called Freedom Convoy, which has jammed major thoroughfares in downtown Ottawa with idling big rigs and other vehicles. He told them that they need to go home. Justin Trudeau, who definitely is not Fidel Castro's son. I'm just going to put that out there. I know there have been some rumors out there that Justin Trudeau is Fidel Castro's son because he looks exactly like Fidel Castro because his mom was known to be a swinger and because his mom was visiting Cuba apparently about 8.5 months before Justin Trudeau was born. That said, he is definitely not Fidel Castro's son, either ideologically or biologically. So I'm just going to put, he is not. Stop that right now. Don't you dare call him Justin Lito. Don't do it. Don't do it. In any case, here is Justin Trudeau, handsome Bernie Sanders, explaining that we need mandates because if we don't have mandates, then how are we going to avoid further restrictions? You see, we have to curb liberty in order so that we can have liberty. Now, this has been the case that Democrats have been making all throughout the pandemic. And you know what caused them to lift the mandates in the United States, as we'll get to? What caused them to lift the mandates was not the changing science. What caused them to lift the mandates was not following the data. What caused them to lift the mandates is that the American people finally said no. And you're starting to see the same thing in Canada. So good for the truckers. Here's Justin Trudeau trying to talk his way through this one.
We've seen the curves lower in Canada than elsewhere. We've seen lower death rates. We've seen quicker economic recovery because Canadians stepped up, because Canadians got vaccinated. And I can understand frustrations with mandates, but mandates are the way to avoid further restrictions or having to be restricted. As people get vaccinated, as Canadians have gotten vaccinated, we've been able to get through things.
I'm sorry, he's so irritating. And by the way, I'm not the only one who finds him irritating. The Canadian public finds him extraordinarily irritating. In fact, Trudeau's own party is starting to turn on him over COVID restrictions. According to Politico, a backbench lawmaker from Justin Trudeau's own caucus is accusing the Prime Minister of dividing and stigmatizing Canadians by politicizing vaccine mandates and COVID-19 restrictions. Joel Lightbound delivered a scathing assessment Tuesday in Ottawa with the big rigs of the so-called Freedom Convoy just outside the door. The convoy protests against COVID measures have grabbed global attention and paralyzed Canada's capital city for more than a week. Lightbound said both the tone and policies of my government changed drastically on the eve and during the last election campaign. A decision was made to wedge, to divide, and to stigmatize. I fear that this politicization of the pandemic risks undermining the public's trust in our public health institutions. This is exactly right, of course. Lightbound insisted he is not the only member of Justin Trudeau's team who feels to varying degrees as he does today. He said he raised his concerns clearly with fellow Liberal MPs and with Trudeau. Trudeau, for his part, he keeps saying that individuals, it's amazing. He says things like individuals are trying to blockade our economy. Individuals are trying to shut down our economy. They're trying to shut down our way of life. Dude, that's you. Buy a mirror. Well, actually, I'm sure Justin Trudeau has mirrors pretty much everywhere in his house. He probably welded them to the walls himself. Well, actually, probably he didn't weld them. He doesn't seem like a welder. He probably paid a peasant to weld. Well, actually, he probably didn't pay the peasant. He probably used Canadian taxpayer dollars to pay a peasant to weld. Actually, that's probably not true. He probably just mandated that a peasant should weld mirrors on his house. Anyway, here is Justin Trudeau explaining that he's shutting down freedom to protect your freedom. There's a lot of burning the village in order to save the village rhetoric that's come out of the COVID restrictionists.
Individuals are trying to blockade our economy, our democracy, and our fellow citizens' daily lives. It has to stop.
It has to stop. Well, I mean, the same thing could be said of the mandates that you have placed on your country over the course of the last couple of years. The Wall Street Journal has a piece today talking about the message of the Canadian trucker protest by the editorial board. Here's what they say. This latest act in a week-long show of civil disobedience is more akin to political life in France or the United States. That it happened in restrained Canada is a signal to the political class across the West. Large swaths of humanity are done with COVID-19 restrictions, mandates, and excessive meddling in their lives. They want to go back to making their own health risk assessments. The Ambassador Bridge, which carries some $323 million in goods daily in cross-border trade, and an estimated $137 billion last year, reopened on Tuesday morning, but truckers continue their protest in Ottawa, which is disturbing the peace and worse in that usually peaceable Canadian capital. The truckers should be prosecuted if they break the law, says the Wall Street Journal, but as the Omicron virus shows itself to be less lethal and positive test rates fall, the truckers are sending a message to Democratic governments. It's time for the pandemic emergency orders to end. And of course, this is true. Nobody wants giant bridges shut down. Obstructing traffic is bad no matter what you are protesting for. However, the cause of this protest happens to be righteous. For 2 years, says the Wall Street Journal, the truckers were classified as essential workers and therefore exempt from vaccine mandates. About 85% of them are vaccinated. But Justin Trudeau, who heads a minority government, has chosen this moment to order that truckers be vaccinated if they want to cross back into the country from the United States. The Canadian left is calling all of these people Trumpians. Trudeau smeared them as, quote, a few people shouting and waving swastikas. But of course, that's not what this is at all. And it just is part of the general left-wing attempt to paint anyone who disagrees with them as a racist or a Nazi. They have this bag of insults that they go to every time somebody disagrees with them, God forbid. And then they just throw them, like, here comes the swastika, boom, just hit them with the swastika. Just say that they're a Nazi. And what is the evidence that the thousands and thousands of people in Ottawa protesting so they can maintain their jobs, that those people are Nazis? He doesn't have any evidence. Instead, what the media have been doing in Canada and elsewhere is they've been nutpicking, is what it's called. They find a few fringe members of the protest, and then they say, these people represent the entire protest, as opposed to the core ideology. And the media, by the way, will do precisely the opposite when it comes to Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter, the cause was not righteous. The cause of Black Lives Matter was predicated on a basic lie, which is that law enforcement across the United States are systemically racist and targeting Black people, which is the only reason a disproportionate number of Black people end up in prison for violent crime, for example. It was predicated on a lie. And then a disproportionate number of those protests broke into actual violence. So what the left said is, you're nutpicking. Stop nutpicking. The people who are burning down stores are not the mainstream of the protests. You have to separate the protesters from the rioters. Okay, fine. Fair enough. But you never do this with people on the right. Ever, 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 ever. You find the craziest person on the right, and then you link them to the entire protest movement. And that's exactly what they've done with the Canadian truckers. And again, this is a global thing. This is not just in Canada. It turns out that human beings do not like having their liberties restricted in this way in the West. They're used to it in China because China is an authoritarian tyranny. They may be used to it in Russia. They may be used to it in actual tyrannical states, but they're really not used to it in the West, and they don't like it. Says the Wall Street Journal, a majority of Canadians don't support the Ottawa protests according to polls, but a recent survey by the Angus Reid Institute found a majority favors lifting restrictions, suggesting the Trudeau mandate, which went into effect on January 15th, was a political miscalculation. By energizing a significant part of the electorate, until now less present in public discourse, he set off a backlash, deepened Canadian polarization, and raised the stakes in a showdown with the truckers. The global left is beginning to feel it, because they've spent the last 2 years insisting they're on the side of the science, and they're not on the side of the science. It turns out that the best thing that they could have done would have been to shield the vulnerable, as they did in Sweden, and then to allow people to live their lives. Instead, they decided to restrict everyone. And again, the pitch is that freedom itself is bad. We have to crack down on people using the word freedom. There's a much trafficked op-ed from a national affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail in Canada called Gary Mason. And the name of the column was How Truck Convoy Protesters Like Pierre Poilievre Have Weaponized Freedom. Weaponized freedom. How dare you use the words freedom to mean freedom? Weaponizing freedom. By the way, it's always the case that for the left, whenever the right does something bad, whenever the left does something bad, according to the left, this means that the right is pouncing. That's the real story. We're weaponizing freedom here on the right. I mean, I would hope that we weaponize freedom. It seems like a good thing to weaponize, frankly. And this columnist says, if you watched any of federal conservative MP Pierre Poilievre's video announcing his candidacy for the leadership of his party, you might have discerned a theme. Freedom. Variations of the word were used 9 times in his 3-minute performance. If he is elected leader and is ultimately successful in becoming prime minister, Mr. Poilievre promised, among other things, to make Canadians the freest people on earth, with freedom to make your own health and vaccine choices, freedom to speak without fear. Freedom over fear, he recently tweeted. This is not by accident, of course. Freedom is a word that gets bandied about a lot these days, but has mostly been co-opted by the alt-right, both here and in the United States. See, if you say freedom, what they hear is Nazi. This is how perverse the wild left, the COVID restrictionist left has become. This columnist says freedom as an ideology has been appropriated by the Make America Great Again wing of the U.S. Republican Party. There's a strong MAGA fan base in this country, apparently with prominent supporters, such as Candice Bergen, the new interim leader of the Federal Conservative Party of Canada. Undated photos circulating on social media appear to show Ms. Bergen sporting a camouflage MAGA hat. Wow, oh no. Wow, man. Trump hats? Well, this is weaponizing freedom, guys. Freedom, of course, says this columnist, has not always been a concept usurped for selfish, malicious purposes. It's been a rallying cry behind great triumphs, such as the end of slavery and the civil rights movement. But others have believed freedom is about protecting property rights, even if that has to occur at the diminishment of democracy. Freedom has nothing to do with property rights, according to these folks. True freedom is seizing other people's property, of course. More recently, political leaders and others, with an unprecedented megaphone in the form of the internet and social media, have used the call for freedom to promote bigoted, racist, anti-democratic ideas. Again, freedom is bad. Freedom is bad because they might say something that this guy doesn't like. As Elizabeth Anker, a professor of American Studies at George Washington University and author of Ugly Freedoms, recently wrote in the New York Times, today, more and more, laws, caucuses, rallies, and hard right movements use the language of freedom as a cudgel to erode democratic governance and civil rights. These laws expand the creep of authoritarianism. Yes, nothing says authoritarianism quite like leave people alone so they can make their own choices about vaccinations and masking. And all of this is ridiculous. It's ridiculous, but because it's ridiculous, they're having a tough time getting out of it. Because to admit they were wrong is kind of a problem for them. Again, Canadian parliamentarians have had it with Trudeau. Trudeau is not popular in Canada. They had an election recently. It sort of re-enshrined the status quo. But nobody actually likes Trudeau. I mean, there's polling out saying that a majority of Canadians think that Trudeau should resign following the election. This was in September. According to the National Post, a vast majority of Canadians believed the country was more divided than ever following that federal election. More than half said Justin Trudeau should step down after a cynical and opportunistic campaign. In a survey by Meru Public Opinion, 77% of respondents said Canada feels more fractured than ever following a summer campaign that produced roughly the same seat count as the last parliamentary session. Just 23% of respondents said the country is now more unified under Trudeau. A slim majority of respondents, 52%, said that Canada's democratic system is entirely broken and needs a major overhaul. So Canadians sound a lot like Americans at this point. This is what happens when the left pushes too far, too fast. One parliamentarian came out against Trudeau yesterday and said, why is it impossible for you to just articulate an off-ramp? This parliamentarian, Raquel Dancho.
How is it that other highly advanced, developed nations like the UK, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, the United States, how is it that they have all the same tools we have, they have all the economic resources we have, their citizens have done all the work and made all the sacrifices? Why is it that those citizens get a plan for hope of when we get back to normal, when we get our lives back, when the people outside, you think they want to be here, Mr. Speaker? Those people don't want to be here. They want to be working. But that right was taken away from them.
She, of course, is exactly correct. And Justin Trudeau is about to feel the wrath of the Canadian people, which is inherently hilarious. The wrath of the Canadians sounds like a really bad horror movie. In any case, the Ottawa police chief, here's the thing. This has been combined with a fascistic crackdown on freedom of speech in Canada. This has been a serious problem in Canada, in Australia, people outlawing protests that they just don't like. Here's Ottawa's police chief saying, well, we can identify and target protesters, not rioters, protesters.
We have increased ability to identify and target protesters and supporters of protesters who are funding and enabling unlawful and harmful activity by the protesters themselves. Investigative evidence gathering teams are collecting financial, digital, vehicle registration, driver identification, insurance status, and other related evidence that will be used in prosecutions.
By the way, can you imagine if the U.S. police had said this during the BLM riots? Like even during the riots, not just during the protests, but imagine they'd said during the protests what this guy's saying. We can track all of the financial information of anyone who gave to a BLM organization, and we intend on finding people who support and enable bad activity. Can you imagine the outcry? The justified outcry, because that's not how freedom of speech is supposed to work. Meanwhile, in the United States, Jen Psaki is busily dismissing the Canadian trucker protests, pretending that they don't matter, even though they're now shutting off a main trade artery to the United States.
I know there's been some suggestion, not by reporters necessarily at all, but that this congestion is related to the vaccine requirements. It's not. I'm saying I'm going to get to the protests, but the protests going on across Canada, which have spread to a bridge, are leading to sporadic congestion and blockages. While we do see some of these congestion due to protests, it's clear that these disruptions have broadened in scope beyond the vaccine requirement implementation.
Again, just dismissing it or broadening it out to be it's a bunch of Nazis. This is the typical tactic. Now, in reality, these politicians are being mugged by reality, which is why Alberta announced that it would be ending its vaccine passport program midnight on Tuesday, according to the Edmonton Journal. Albertans are waking up Wednesday to what could be the beginning of the end of COVID restrictions in this province, despite warnings the government may be moving too quickly. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney announced Tuesday the province's COVID-19 vaccine passport program will end immediately. At an evening news conference, Kenney said the restriction exemption program has served its purpose, but is no longer needed because Alberta passed the peak of Omicron infections about 3 weeks ago. Okay, so do you think he is doing this because of the data? Or do you think he's doing this because of the protests? It turns out public protest does mobilize politicians. Politicians are not motivated by data. They're not motivated by, quote unquote, doing the right thing. They're motivated by political incentive structures. This has always been true. Kenney said, none of this has anything to do with a few trucks parked at the Coots border crossing. He said, I think it would be a bit of a mug's game to say, keep this going for a few days when we know that in many areas we're already having compliance problems. Oh, okay, so it has nothing to do with the protests, according to these folks. Sure. Meanwhile, CNN is very upset about the trucker convoy that's been blocking the U.S.-Canada bridge. Again, they had no problems whatsoever with mass widespread rioting in the United States across 2020. But when a bridge is blocked, then we've really, now we've reached the end of democracy here.
The question is, how is it going to stop? Justin Trudeau does not seem like he is going to be getting out here to negotiate or mediate anything at this point. They are saying that, look, this is a fringe minority. And yet people here say that is not the case, that there is a significant minority. Kate, I will tell you, this isn't something the Biden administration can ignore, especially given those bridge crossings. There could be impacts to the supply chain between the United States and Canada.
Okay, so here is the reality. All across the world, left-wing politicians are learning the hard way that their populations are not willing to do this crap indefinitely. And so they are shifting. Now they're going to pretend that they're shifting because they're quote unquote doing the right thing, because the data have changed, because the underlying conditions have changed. And this now allows them to free up. They were right in the first place and they're right now. Wrong. That's a lie. The simple fact is precisely the opposite. They are changing because the people have finally decided they have had enough and they are feeling the writing on the wall. Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?